Good evening, everyone, and welcome to SocialFlight Live. I'm Jeff Simon. We have a fascinating show for you this evening. Mark Clark is here, president of Courtesy Aircraft Sales. And as we lead up to going to Oshkosh and the AirVenture show, what could be better than learning all about Warbirds and Warbird ownership? And Mark will be there at the show. We'll talk about all sorts of things like that. So it's a great opportunity, and I cannot wait to dive into that discussion. Before we get started, a few things. First of all, SocialFlight's Fly to Win Challenge is in full swing right now. We just gave away a Lightspeed Zulu 3 headset, and now it is time for us to give away an Aspen E5 electronic flight instrument, glass for your cockpit that you can have at no charge just by winning the Fly to Win Challenge. We're giving that away August 1st, and all you need to do is get the free SocialFlight mobile app for your Android or iPhone and just go to your local airport and check in. And then every time you check in at an airport as you go and fly, you get points. Even if you check in only once, you're entered into a win. The odds are fantastic. And then if you go and check in at many more, you'll get enough points perhaps to get on our leaderboard and get extra entries into our Fly to Win challenge. So it's just a great opportunity, and I cannot wait for someone to win that Aspen E5 electronic flight instrument. Speaking of AirVenture, we will be there, and we're running our Snag Some Swag promotion that we're going to be doing. And so you will see, I will be there walking the grounds. We don't have booths. We're just all over AirVenture, visiting many of our partners, and I'll be there. Jake will be there. Ben will be there. Track one of us down, see us at the show, and if we still have stuff on us from that day, you could get some great SocialFlight swag. We'll just be giving it away as we walk around the show. So we've got that, as well as some cool prizes from some of our partners. One last note, we have a really cool new feature coming out in SocialFlight for the web and for the mobile products. We're not going to talk too much about what the detail is, but it's going to be coming out soon. It's going to be fantastic, and we are looking for just a few volunteers from around the country to just help us out as we get this wrapped up and get a little more of the information that we need to make this perfect for you. And so if anyone's interested in helping out, all you need to do is send an email to info@socialflight.com. That's info, I-N-F-O, @socialflight.com. We'll get back to you, help us out with a little bit of help, and it's just going to be a fantastic thing that we'll be announcing here shortly. Tonight's broadcast is brought to us by iFly EFB, by the folks who came up with Adventure Pilot. Absolutely wonderful people, Walter and Juanita Boyd, that created this product. And I'll tell you, iFly EFB, if you're looking for an alternative to paying the high dollar value for some of the other EFBs on the market for flight planning, you need to go check this out. Just look for iFly EFB. There's a free trial. You can check it out for yourself. And again, it's got incredible features, very inexpensive, and I'm grateful that they are added to our board here, making all of this available to you here at SocialFlight. So with that, I would like to get to our guest for this evening. Now, if you want to own a Warbird, if you have any Walter Mitty dreams of doing something like this, there is one man at the top of everyone's list, and that is Mark Clark, president of Courtesy Aircraft Sales. Mark has been an aircraft broker for over 45 years and has sold in excess of 2,900 aircraft to date, specializing in historic military aircraft. As a pilot, Mark has logged over 7,500 hours in more than 125 types of aircraft, including more than 1,800 hours in high-performance ex-military aircraft. He holds an unlimited letter from the FAA for all makes and models, and is also the recipient of the Wright Brothers Master Pilot Award from the FAA. And in addition to his flying, he also holds an FAA Airframe and Powerplant mechanic certificate. So talk about a well-rounded individual. I mean, having such in-depth and hands-on knowledge of historic aircraft makes Mark Clark the go-to person in the specialized field of Warbird ownership. And we're going to hear all about that tonight. I am going to bring Mark on the line now. Please help me welcome to SocialFlight Live, Mark Clark. How are you doing, Mark?
Great. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate the opportunity to come on tonight, and hopefully I can answer a few questions and give you a little insight into Warbird world and Oshkosh that's coming up, and a little bit about my background. So ask away.
Well, let's start with your background because you have probably one of the most fun booths there are at the show at AirVenture because you're constantly dabbling in all the planes that we all come to see all in one place. So give us some background. How did you become the Mark Clark that we all know now? That's Mr. Warbird.
Well, I've always been Mark Clark, but growing up here in Rockford, and I think most people realize that before Oshkosh was in Oshkosh, it was in Rockford from 61 until 61 to 69. 70 was the first year at Oshkosh. So as a teenager, I kind of got dumped out at the airport during the show and slowly gravitated towards Warbirds. And my father was a pilot and always had some type of a small airplane and was always involved in sales. He was in the automotive business, but always had an airplane or two for sale. And one day he asked me, he said, "Would you like to learn to fly?" And I said, "Oh, yeah." I used to ride around with him in his airplanes and talk on the radio and navigate with the charts and all of that stuff. And he said, "Would you like to fly?" And I said, "Yeah, I sure would." So he pointed at a guy. We were at the local Cessna Flight Center. And he says, "Well, you better get over there." He says, "There's your instructor. He's ready for your first lesson." Whoa. That was pretty cool. And I was 15 and 3 months old, so I took lessons for 9 months before I was legally able to solo. So everybody said, "How long did it take you solo?" Well, it took me 30 hours because I wasn't old enough yet. But I was lucky to get my solo on my 16th birthday, and I got my private on my 17th birthday. And my first passenger was my mother, who was actually a very timid flyer, but she held it all together so I could take her for a ride in a Cherokee 140, and she remembered that all of her life. She enjoyed that. So
Wow.
that was pretty nice to be able to do that.
No kidding. That's a great memory. So how do you start down the journey towards Warbirds?
Well, hanging around at EAA Rockford in those days, I just gravitated towards the Warbird area. And as I went through high school, I got some additional ratings and started to ferry airplanes for Courtesy Aircraft, the company my dad had at that time. And I ferried airplanes every summer. I washed airplanes, I polished airplanes. I would ferry airplanes. When I was 17, my birthday's in February, so the summer of my 17th birthday, I took a Cherokee 140 that we had sold, and I delivered it to LaGuardia Airport. So, somebody that about 80 hours total time flying into LaGuardia in a Cherokee 140 was an educational experience, but it was pretty cool. And then I started working as an apprentice mechanic at one of the shops here on the airport, and still ferrying airplanes, on weekends and that kind of stuff. And then I went off 4 years of college for a degree in marketing, came back to the airport, and went back to the same shop as an apprentice mechanic and ferried airplanes on the side. Ended up as a co-pilot, got my A&P there as an apprentice. And then I ended up as a co-pilot mechanic on a twin-engine Cessna for a local company here, and then graduated up to co-captain and did that for a couple of years, and then decided I wanted to get fully involved in the airplane sales business rather than be a corporate pilot. So, that way I could still fly, but I always liked the sales activity and meeting the customers and delivering the airplanes to people. That was a lot of fun. So that's kind of where it started.
And that was with regular civilian aircraft. What about Warbirds? How did that come into the picture?
Well, that interest I had in Warbirds that was sparked really by EAA in Rockford. I convinced the president of the company at that time, my father, that we really needed to buy a T6. So we bought a T6 out of Seattle, and we had a guy pick it up and bring it back here, and he checked me out in the airplane. So I was very fortunate to be flying a T6 when I was 18. And still
what did that argument look like? I had to convince my dad, the owner of the business, that we needed a T6, because a T6 isn't for what? It's not for hauling stuff.
Well, I think I convinced him this would be a nice addition to our fleet of airplanes that were for sale, and that we could fly it and enjoy it a little bit, and at the end of the day sell it and make a few bucks on it, which we luckily did. And I think that first one we paid $5,500 for. So flew it a year or two and sold it at a profit over that. So there's the profit was obviously important, but the experience was even more important.
There's going to be some people with heartburn over the idea that you were able to get a T6 for $5,500.
The first Mustang the company bought, we paid $12,000 for it. So that'll really give you heartburn.
12,000 for a flying Mustang.
Yep. Yep.
Oh my goodness. That's amazing. So, when was the first time you got a ride in the Mustang?
The first time I got a ride in a Mustang was in Rockford at the air show. I think it was probably in the mid 60, 65, 66 range. And at that time, you could snag a ride in a Mustang for $1 a minute. So I went with the fellow from St. Louis, rode in the back, and I gave him my $25, and we came into Rockford, and we had to do a couple of go-arounds. So I got 35 minutes for $25. So that was the first Mustang bargain. So
Was that, I mean, a lot of people describe their kind of first experiences around a Mustang. Was that something that was a seminal moment for you?
Well, it was something. I had always been interested in Mustangs. My interest in Mustangs really started with the post-war racing era, and I just was intrigued by those airplanes, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, these airplanes from 46 to 49. I see them in some of the books, but were those airplanes still around? And the majority of those airplanes were still around, and I just kind of intrigued. And I still today, I mean, I love the military schemes and the authenticity and the restorations. But when I see a Mustang in civilian colors, yeah, I think it's really cool. You don't see them hardly anymore, but I think those are just really cool.
That is pretty wild. So let's talk about kind of what qualifies as a Warbird, because I think obviously a lot of people think about the big ones that you see, the Mustangs, the Corsairs, or the Bombers. But when we talk about attainability or where people can kind of start, it actually seems to go all the way down to some pretty small planes that are military versions of civilian aircraft. So tell me a little bit about how that part of the market, and as we kind of work our way up.
That's been kind of interesting. In kind of the early days of Oshkosh, if you didn't have anything, if you had anything T6 or above, you could be a quote Warbird. But as the prices went up and the people started to appreciate the history of the airplanes, it went to some of the liaison airplanes, the smaller, less than 600 horsepower airplanes, Stearmans and all of the L-birds, the military Cubs and Champs and all of those. So there's really, even today there's this gigantic broad spectrum of airplanes, ranging from, a 65 horse military Cub all the way up to 4-engine bombers. So there's really kind of something for everybody out there.
Yeah, I've always found it interesting that there's that angle of civilian aircraft that had military uses. Even like I think recently I saw an O2 with the military version of the 337, if I have that correct.
Right.
And many of them have quite a history. Many of them served, and and in that case, I think had a long Vietnam history of being a spotter and things like that.
And I think that's an interesting observation, because we're unfortunately getting to the end of the greatest generation, and those guys are going away. But the later airplanes, the Korean airplanes, the Vietnam airplanes, there's a lot of airplanes in those time frames that are relatively affordable, but they also are very interesting to the people of the next generation after the greatest generation. And so you go to air shows, and the O2 is a fantastic airplane. The L-17 Navion had a long history in the military. So there's a lot of airplanes out there that people can relate to. And you're sitting under the wing of a Mustang at an air show, and a guy comes by and he's talking to his kid or his grandson, and hey, that's what your grandpa flew, or that's what your mother worked on, or remember that plant down the road that's abandoned, that's where they made those airplanes. So virtually everybody, one way or another, has a connection to these airplanes. And I think that's one of the coolest things, the history. I mean, it's great to be able to fly a 1,492 horsepower P-51, but not everybody can do that. So to be able to share those airplanes with those people that their relatives had a big connection to, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I do like the fact that there's this opportunity for everyone to come in at whatever level fits where they are, and then of course if they're able to grow over time into something else, that's even better. But are you also a starting point where you are for people to come in and maybe they're looking for a bird dog, maybe they're looking for for something for
We
its nostalgia and for its history.
Yeah. Well, we've pretty much handled virtually everything. I actually have a very nice bird dog for sale right now. It's based up in Canada. It had a real interesting history as a glider tow airplane for the Royal Canadian Air Force, and it's been all restored. Very very nice airplane. I don't really have any L-birds right at the moment, other than that one. No O2s, but we've got a few T6s, T28s, have a couple T-34s coming in, and then some of the jets and some of the bigger airplanes are always coming and going. So
What do you view as some of the best starting points if you know that someone even if it's not necessarily a money issue, even if it's something where they come to you and say, I've got aspirations for it, but I'm low time. Where do I want to start if I'm going to work with you all the way kind of through? What do you usually point them towards?
well, I think if you're looking at one of the World War II tailwheel airplanes, Mustang, Corsair, P-40, those types of airplanes, then the tailwheel skills are super important. And
Hmm.
the AT6 is or SNJ, the Navy called it, is a fantastic airplane. There's several really good schools around the country that you can go and get checked out in one of those airplanes and kind of see if you like it. If you have zero tailwheel time, then you need to get some time in a Champ or a Super Cub or a Husky or something like that, and just get the basic seat of your pants, looking out the window. The glass panels and all that are fine, but you just need to know. You just need to be able to feel the airplane and see what the airplane is doing, and then work your way up from there. If you're not interested in tail wheels, then there's a number of airplanes. The Beech T-34 is an excellent airplane. T-28 is a great airplane, but I think some of the bigger airplanes that are heavier, like the T-28 and the Mustang, or like that, are good airplanes. But I think you need some time in a light twin or something that's a little bit faster. You need to be able to handle the mass of the airplane. You need to be able to think about, think ahead. Where's this airplane going to be in 30 seconds? Where's it going to be in a minute? I'm cruising along at 11,500 feet. Oh, the airport is 3 miles away. Well, I need to plan ahead to get down to the pattern altitude in 3 miles. So there's a lot of things, and of course the bigger the airplane is, the more complicated it can be. So there's some systems knowledge, and I'm being an A&P, I kind of enjoy the systems knowledge. I like that. I like learning that about these airplanes and understanding the systems. I think that's, I enjoy it, but I think the guys that are flying the airplane, also need to understand that. Like T-28s, there's a real good ground school down in Texas. Stallion 51 down in Florida does the Mustangs and the T6 and L39 upsets. So there's a number. Tom Richards at Warbird Adventures does a great job in the T6 and basic tail wheel, and there's a number of schools out on the West Coast and stuff that could do that too. So
Hmm. Now, when you talk about, I mean, obviously that kind of splits things into two categories: the tailwheel aircraft versus and what direction you're going in versus the T-28 being, obviously having the nose wheel. Does that mean that even though there's a lot of systems to learn on the T-28, does that make a Trojan a somewhat easier aircraft to fly? I'd always heard that a Texan was kind of like the ultimate trainer because you really have to you have to work at it. It's not that easy.
well, they're different airplanes. Certainly the T6 or the SNJ is a tailwheel airplane. Very simple systems. A much lighter airplane, a 5,300 pound gross airplane, and a T-28 is a big airplane with an engine that's more than double the horsepower, more systems, but it's a nose wheel airplane, so that's a little easier transition for some people. But you're still looking at an airplane, around 8,000 to 8,500 pound airplane, so it's considerably heavier, and there's a lot more mass in that airplane than the T6. So there's kind of a trade-off on various things. So
Yeah, I've always wondered, and maybe have some insight to this, that though it doesn't seem like there's a progression between those two so much. It seems like some people are T6 directed people and some people are T28 directed people. Um, do
There,
you?
there, there is a little of that, but you know, there are some of the people out there that have a T6 and then they have a T28, and a lot of my customers will buy an airplane and then have the airplane for 4, 5, 6 years, and then they call up, they say, look, I've done this, I want to do something else. What would you do? I don't, I've never, I've got 250 or 400 hours in my T6. I'd really like to fly a 1425 horsepower T28. So, I'll sell one and sell them another one. And people, and a lot of the fighter guys, well, I've got a lot of Mustang time. I'm going to sell my Mustang. I'm going to get a Corsair or a P40 just to experience the differences in the airplane. And they all have their differences. But at the end of
Hmm.
the day, they're interesting, they're historical, and they've proven over time to be a really, really good investment. So
Oh yeah, I can
that's it.
imagine. Is there any type of progression path that's kind of common? Do people tend to do like Stearman's and then move towards the T6 or something like that?
Oh, not really. I mean, they tend to go up in size and horsepower, but there's not a really well defined. I think, in some cases, they just want to do this experience, and if somebody comes in and they have, 100 hours of tailwheel time in a light airplane, a Champ or a Husky or something like that, they need that T6 time,
Hmm.
and they may do the T6, and that's kind of the top of the chain for them, or they may say, I want to do a Mustang or I want to do some kind of tail dragger fighter. Well, then you need that T6 time. It's really important.
One of the things I find fascinating and really cool in a way is that even though the values have gone up a lot, obviously, and they're, well, astronomically compared to the stories you told about a long time ago, but even recently when values have gone up so much, when I look at some of the things on your site, they seem attainable. I mean, if you want a T6 Texan, this isn't, you're not looking at, you don't have to have $1 million of discretionary income to spend on an airplane.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that range, because I don't think a lot of people see something as massive as a T6 and think, well, it's actually less than if you wanted a Bonanza right now or something.
Right. Yeah. It is from that perspective, especially in the trainer category, they are pretty good values. Now, if you have a Bonanza or a Baron or something like that, you've got 5 or 6 seats. You've got better all-weather capability. In the T6, the T28 or T34, there's only 2 seats in it. It's not, you're probably not going to fly it, on a 3-week vacation. But you've got air shows to go to, lots of fun things. The guys in the T6s and the 34s and the 28s and some of the L-birds now are really getting into the formation flying. And you've been to
Hmm.
Oshkosh, you've seen the mass formations. Those just don't happen randomly. I mean, there's a rigid training and checking program to be able to fly formation in waivered airspace at Oshkosh or any other air show that has waivered airspace. You just can't go to your buddy in the hangar and say, hey, let's go to so-and-so and jump in and do some formation flying at the Sun and Fun or at Oshkosh. It's a very rigid, controlled situation, and
Right.
it's worked out very well. The groups that do that, they're very serious about it, and I think that's just another level of proficiency that a lot of the pilots really like. They enjoy the discipline of that. Not
Yeah,
not
so
everybody who's in the
it's a
military.
passion, right? I mean, it's a passion that you can get into. So, I mean, I think, one way of looking at it is economically in terms of purchase price, people change over time. You downsize your house, different things change.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, sure, we've got, we fly a Bonanza with 6 seats in it because we needed all the 6 seats. But at some point in time, everybody's got their own life in the family, and you start not needing the 6 seats anymore. And at some point in time, you might say, hey, what I really want to do is that formation flying or take something to an air show. And it's not, you're still in the same economic area if you want to switch over to something like that. Um,
Certainly do
that
that.
When you look at a lot of your customers, is that one of the things that really attracts them to it? The idea that they can buy a Warbird and then kind of be on the other side of the fence, go and display it at air shows, display it at a lot of places, and share the aircraft and take people up for rides in a different way than you would in a GA aircraft?
Well, I think the owners enjoy flying these interesting, nostalgic, and in some cases kind of challenging airplanes. And I think they enjoy sharing that with other people. I mean, not every pilot owns an airplane. So, and not every guy on the outside of the fence is ever going to own an airplane, is ever going to learn how to fly. But being able to share the airplane at a local pancake breakfast or anything like that, is important to people. And people enjoy seeing these airplanes.
And it's such a wonderful experience to share that. I know anytime that someone's offered me a ride in one of those types of aircraft, it's just, I'm in heaven, and they love the ability of sharing that. And so that it's pretty cool. I think it's different than the feeling you might have just kind of owning a plane that you use more as a tool, and giving someone a ride. You're really sharing a piece of history, which is really neat.
Exactly. And I think that's really important.
Now, most of the ones that we've talked about now, we're talking about either American or Canadian aircraft. There's also a lot of aircraft out there, even before we start getting into the real exotics, that are a little like less known, but still great, really cool airplanes. Nanchang's version, or the Yaks, or things like that. Tell me a little bit about the opportunities for those types of aircraft, which I think historically have also been very economical and very interesting aircraft to show up with.
Well, I think a lot of those airplanes have come into vogue, so to speak, as the prices of the American airplanes went up a little ways. I think people looked for some alternatives, and there are a number of those. Being kind of an American history buff, I tend to do a little more with the American airplanes than I do, with the foreign airplanes. But we've sold a number of those in the past. There's some really good type clubs on the Yaks and the CJs and the Red Star pilots and those guys. And that's one thing. Virtually every one of these types, the T6s, the T28s, the Mustangs, they have the North American Trainers Association. The T-34 has the T-34 Association. The Navion group is now part of the North American Trainer Association, because the Navions were built by North American. But I think that's two things that I would recommend. If you're interested in a certain type, join some of the type clubs. Even if you don't have an airplane, you can still join. And then I think there's a number of groups, the Commemorative Air Force and a lot of the museums, that are always looking for people to volunteer and help them and get around. So you can't really stand on the outside of the fence. And a lot of aviation, be it pilot, mechanic, whatever, is being at the right place at the right time. But when you stand on the other side of the fence, you need to go up and knock on the door to the museum or whatever it is and say, I'm really intrigued by what you have. Can I sweep the floor? Can I help? Can I flip pancakes or something like that? So, I mean, you need to get your foot in the door. And I think that's one of the things that I think we need to continue to do with the younger pilots, is give these younger pilots an opportunity to be involved. I mean, back when I was growing up, I mean, you'd go out and, you'd wipe somebody's airplane off for a ride. And we need a little more of that. And unfortunately, with lots of things in the crazy world today, some of those opportunities are a little more difficult with the fencing and, all of TSA and all of that stuff. But still, I mean, if somebody has a passion, there's a way to explore that passion, and it doesn't necessarily have to cost you a lot of money. So I think that's really important. If young people, let them be involved. And groups like the EAA and the AOPA and the Sun and Fun organization and there's hundreds of them around that are doing great jobs with young people, getting them involved at a young age. The Young Eagles program, those are fantastic opportunities to get younger people involved.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like we need to make up some big stickers for outside of aircraft for everybody to go, and more people to start using that say, "Ask me for a ride."
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
So let's talk about some when you start getting into some of the more amazing aircraft that are out there, and you've had many of them on your site, but then you start to get into, instead of trainers, real fighters, or well, and then we'll get into the bombers a little bit later. But I know you've got, I think, a Sea Fury that you're doing right now. That and there's some other ones out there. Let me see if I can find a picture of the Sea Fury that you've got to share with people. I'll show this right now. That, assuming that I opened the correct plane.
Yep, you did. Fantastic airplane. Certainly, really the Sea Fury is a post-war airplane, and the aerodynamics are very good. It's a lovely, lovely airplane to fly. The original had the British Centaurus engine, which is a very interesting sleeve valve engine. It doesn't have the normal valves. It has a sleeve outside of the piston that goes up and down and rotates in the cylinder and opens and closes the intake and the exhaust ports. So mechanically, it's extremely interesting. And they had, of course, the British engines turned backwards compared to what we have, and they had the 5-blade Rotal prop. So it has a really cool look on the ground. Unfortunately, kind of the support on that British engine is difficult. So most of the Sea Furies have been re-engineered or re-engined with an American engine, and that makes it that much more maintainable.
And there's that. There's at least that one's what, a 4-blade on that one?
Yeah, that's a 4-blade. That's got a 3350 engine in it. It's actually a Skyraider engine, Curtiss Wright 3350 engine out of a Skyraider, and the 4-bladed prop is a Hamilton Standard off of some type of an airliner, I think.
Wow. So when you start getting into, whether it be post-war or actually, war aircraft, that seems like that's a whole different category. What do you counsel people about when they start thinking, I want to start thinking about, aircraft in this category, aircraft that are a lot to handle?
Well, there again, I think we get back to the basic flying proficiency. And if it's a tailwheel airplane, the more tailwheel T6 time, or like a Beech 18, or some heavier tailwheel time would be great. And then if it's a nose wheel airplane like the T-28 or a King Cobra, those type of airplanes, there you get into the heavier airplanes, Twins, Barons, 400 series Cessnas, that kind of weight and speed and thinking ahead of the airplane. Those are important things. And you're not going to jump from a Cessna 182 to a T-28. You're not going to jump from a Husky to a Mustang or a Sea Fury in one leap. It's going to take a little bit.
What do you want to see someone generally do if they're looking at, they come to you and say, look, my even if they've already had a T20, or a SNJ for quite a while, and they come and they want to move up to something really serious like a Corsair or something that's a lot of metal, and the last time I climbed up to one, it felt like I was climbing 3 stories up.
Yeah, well, a lot of it, I think there's really two facets to that. One is the pilot proficiency side, and then the other is kind of the attitude of the pilot. Okay, I know I've got some steps to climb to get that way, and I understand that I will do what it takes to get there. I'm not going to rush the process. I'm going to get the proper training from some people that are knowledgeable about those airplanes, and then I'm going to work my way up. And that progression and the speed of that progression is different for everybody. There's not a set hard and fast rule. Insurance companies dictate a little of that based on kind of the overall portfolio of an individual pilot.
Wow. When you think about the high performance singles, what comes to mind as, let's say, one of the hardest ones, one of the most challenging ones to fly?
Well, there again, it depends on your background. I had a lot of T6 time before I flew a Stearman. I kind of went backwards in my progression. I went from a Citabria to a T6, and I had several hundred hours of T6 time, and I had the opportunity to fly a Stearman. And it was frankly a little bit of a challenge. The gear is, I mean, you don't have a constant speed prop, you don't have retractable gear, you don't have flaps, any of that stuff. But the gear, landing gear on the Stearman is very narrow, and the airplane sits high above the gear, so it's a different picture. The geometry is different, and you know, until you get used to it, I mean, it's in some ways it's harder to fly than the T6. And then you go to the Mustang, and everybody says, "Wow, that thing's got all that horsepower and all those things." But the Mustang has wider gear than the T6. If you touch down at the proper speed and you're making your proper wind correction, it's actually a very easy airplane to fly. And we'll fly the Mustang 10 hours, and then they'll get back in the T6 and they'll say, "Wow, how did I ever fly that airplane for 50 hours?" So they're all different.
What about, you've flown so many of these, what about some of the cats, the Hellcat or Wildcat, or even then the Corsair?
Yeah, I've flown the Corsair. I have never flown any of the other cats, so I can't really speak on that. I've flown the Corsair and the TBM, the Mustang.
What were your experiences on those? What were what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've always been a Mustang guy. I mean, that's my favorite fighter. And I actually added up a year or two ago, and I've been lucky enough to be involved in around 80 sales of Mustangs over the years, and I have probably flown, I don't know, probably 45 different Mustangs, luckily.
Really?
You know, just in the big picture. I mean, I'm just a very fortunate person. You know, I soloed in a Cessna 150. I did not have a military background, but I've kind of worked my way through the system, and I've had some fantastic opportunities to do these things.
So out of those, the only other one that you flew, you said was the Corsair. What was that one like?
And the Sea Fury. The Sea Fury is the lightest, nicest flying of the fighters that I have flown. The Mustang, it's a Mustang. I mean, what more can you say? That's kind of everybody's dream, and it certainly was my dream. The Corsair has a big, roomy cockpit. The nose looks like, it looks like it's 150 feet in front of the cockpit. But it's kind of fun when you're flying. The Mustang nose is narrower and a little shorter, but when you're flying, the Sea Fury is the same way as the Corsair. That nose sticks out there a long ways, so you can see instantly. You don't need to look at your ball on the panel. You can see if the nose is moving left or right, really, really quickly. I mean, it's just a little teeny bit of rudder pressure, and that nose is all over the place. So you know if you're flying coordinated or not, because the nose is out there telling you.
That's definitely pretty interesting. What would you say, what comes to mind as maybe one of the most unique aircraft that you've come across in your years of dealing with them?
You know, I don't. To me, they're all kind of unique. Been fortunate enough to sell a couple of B-17s over the years. The Martin Marauder B-26, that's kind of a unique airplane. I rode in one as a co-pilot, never was pilot in command, but that's a very rare airplane, and that was pretty cool. It was to be involved in that. That was neat. It went to Kermit Weeks down in Florida, who's one of the biggest collectors in the country, and he has it in his museum down there. It's not flying right now, but Kermit has just completed a fantastic restoration of a Douglas A-26 Invader, and it's planned to be at Oshkosh this year. So that's kind of neat.
Yeah, it is amazing at Oshkosh. You get to see some of these ones that there's one of, or some very, very rare aircraft. You mentioned a lot of the planes you end up seeing more than once. That they stay, just as we are caretakers, even of the planes that GA planes that we fly, that are around. Is the supply slowly growing because of restorations, or is it kind of static? What do you think's happening?
Probably close to static. Unfortunately, there will be some airplanes damaged every year. Luckily, the technology is out there today to take what 20 years ago was a total wreck and rebuild the airplanes. There's some fantastic shops around that can pretty much reverse engineer anything they need to do on the airplane. We get into some of the engine parts and stuff like that. That's a little more complicated. But I mean, the basic structures of these airplanes, the ribs and the spars and the wing skins and all of that, are pretty basic, simple, 40s technology. It's not, they're not titanium and that kind of stuff. So they can be rebuilt. So I would say, probably in a couple of year time period, there's a plus factor in there. There are more airplanes coming on. Not, in a year period, you're not going to see 25 new restorations, but you'll see 3 or 4 or a handful of new restorations.
I know you help people find projects as well, because I know that you also sell projects and project aircraft. Are those things that people come and say, look, I'm looking to find a core somewhere around the country, or a wreck somewhere around, or a find, and restore something really unique? Is that something that you work with?
That. We've got several project airplanes for sale right now. The quantity of projects that are out there has dried up somewhat because so many of them have been rebuilt, and they're out there flying on the circuit. The positive of a half a dozen new airplanes every year, well, that's a half a dozen less projects. So the projects are, they're getting a little harder to find. It used to be, if somebody says, hey, I want a T6 project, there were 10 of them for sale in the country, and right now there's probably 2 or 3. That's it.
What's the main reason that people would do a project like that? In some cases, you think economics, but with aircraft, projects are rarely economic gains. So what's the reason?
I think, I'm an A&P, you're an A&P. We're kind of hands-on kind of people. And I think we enjoy that challenge of taking something and making it better than we started with. And it may not make total economic sense, but if you're going to go out and spend $200,000-300,000 for a T-28, that's a pretty big chunk of change. Or $2-3 million for a Mustang. That's a pretty big chunk of change up front. But if you buy a project for some number less, it's kind of really, I tell people, it's kind of like self-financing. You don't go out and borrow the money and make a payment every month. You don't need all the money up front for a project. You start on the sheet metal, and then when you get close, you buy the tires, and you send the engine out for overhaul, and you get your radio guy to come and help you wire the airplane. So it really works out. It's kind of self-financing the project, and when you get done, you know what you've got, and it's very similar to guys, with the home-built, airplanes, the Vans RV series, and all of those airplanes. The pride of ownership and the pride of, I made this airplane. That's pretty cool.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you every once in a while you hear one of these things about like the crated aircraft, historic aircrafts that are found and able to be projects? Have you ever come across anything like that?
Oh, there are a few. The majority of those things end up to be kind of old wives' tales. And for a long time, not for probably the last 10 years, but for a while there was about a 10-year period where I had one guy call me once a year. Well, I know where there's some airplanes in a cave, and blah blah blah. Send me the pictures. Well, it's in Arizona or whatever. And there's something just popped up the other day on the Warbird Resource Group about somebody found, I think it was 8 hurricanes or something like that in Ukraine.
Oh yeah.
And then the Burma Spitfires, that thing's been going around forever, and so. Well,
I think the Ukraine one's correct. I think though the condition is that maybe you'll get a little tag out of it or something.
Well, look at Great Glacier Girl, P-38 from the ice cap, in Greenland. That airplane is flying today. Massive restoration project. And I'm sure there's a lot of stuff on YouTube. And I know I saw some pictures down in this cave where they had a couple 100 feet under the ice cap, and they had about a 10-foot diameter hole that they went down, and they took that airplane apart in pieces. And there's no way you'd catch me down there 200 feet below the ice cap. I don't care what was down there. I'm not going to be there.
Now, I know there's some, when we talk about some very different aircraft, you've got one that I saw on your site that I remember seeing one of these up near my location up in Beverly Airport not that long ago, and that's a Vampire.
Yes, yeah.
Talk about a strange plane. There's wood in this one. I mean,
Well,
take me through this.
the what they call the pod area, which is basically around the cockpit, basically from pretty much the front, just about even with the front spar. That is a molded plywood impregnated structure, I guess you'd call it. Very much, I mean, it's a de Havilland airplane, and obviously the de Havilland Mosquito. The whole airplane was built that way. The whole fuselage it is. And this is an early jet. This particular airplane has been extensively refurbished. It actually has a glass panel in it. That whole front wooden pod thing, that's one of the big problems with those airplanes. They sit around and they get moisture in there. Well, that's not a problem with this one because hundreds of hours have been spent redoing that. So if somebody wants something a little different, a single engine, 2-seat jet, this is really a pretty neat option. And it's $159,000. It's less than a T6, less than a T28, but you're looking at a few hundred gallons an hour of fuel burn also. So it's kind of a trade-off.
I didn't realize that it was actually, I mean, that was the price point. That's when you think about what you're getting for it, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it really is. And it's got some spare parts and all the manuals, of course, with the airplane. So I mean, if somebody wants something different, everybody's got a T6 or a T28 or a T34, but not every airport has a Vampire. So
Yeah, I remember, again, my memory might not be perfect, but I remember quite a while ago, the one that I saw, they had said that they had done carrier landings at some point where they do that gear up landing on a mat or something with the Vampires, like from a historic perspective. So I don't know what the story is, but it's a very, very unique aircraft. That is for sure.
now that may be an emergency procedure. And I actually have a copy of the Vampire manual, but I haven't had a chance to read it. So I'll have to look through and see if that's
see if there's a rubber mat or if that's another tale.
Bring 1,200 mattresses and you'll be fine.
So what's it take to transition into this? You're talking about something that is less than a brand new 172. So what is if someone looks at this and says, Mark, that looks pretty amazing. What do I need to do to go that route? If assuming they can afford that fuel burn.
Yeah, well, I actually had this very discussion with a prospective buyer of this airplane earlier today, and the FAA, if the airplane comes down here, it would be in the experimental exhibition category. The FAA requires a minimum of 1,000 hours of flying time in order to qualify you in that airplane to get your experimental type rating. You would have training to proficiency, and then you would take a check ride with an FAA designated Warbird exam.
Are you saying 1,000 total time or 1,000 in that aircraft?
No, 1,000 total time.
Oh, okay, because that's not bad. Okay.
No.
Awful lot of people out there with that. That doesn't sound crazy. So someone comes to you and says, "Oh, okay." So I come to you. I've got a couple thousand hours plus of flight time, and I say, "What is it going to take?" What would you tell me?
Well, it's going to take training to proficiency. The owner of the airplane has got a couple very good instructors that would be available, and then there are several FAA designated pilot examiners. So you would do your proficiency, go through all the maneuvers, emergency procedures, various types of takeoffs and landings, dead stick, simulated flame out landings, those types of things. And then your instructor would sign you off in order to take your check ride. Just really like a private pilot. I mean, you don't take your check ride until your instructor says you're ready to go. So you'd get signed off in this to take check ride, and then you would schedule with one of these examiners, and you would get together with him and you would take your check ride and basically demonstrate to him your knowledge of the airplane, your knowledge of systems, and your knowledge of the flight characteristics and procedures in the airplane. So it's a pretty straightforward deal, and that experimental aircraft type rating applies to experimentally certified turbine airplanes, and it's also for any piston airplanes that are over 800 horsepower, like the T28 and some of the other ones. Now, the Mustang is in limited category. Some of the P40s are. So they actually have a limited category type certificate that does not require an experimental type rating, but some of the P40s, the Corsair, the Sea Furies, those types of airplanes are not in the limited category, so they will need this experimental type rating. And it's not, I mean, if you're a proficient pilot, it's not a big deal.
Mm. So
Because you
as
have to.
someone who is a not just obviously an experienced pilot, but A&P mechanic, and then also dealing with all the maintainers and having experience with all these aircraft, how do you help quantify the other big question I'm sure you get, which is what's maintenance going to be like on an airplane like this?
Um, yes, there will be maintenance, no question about it. You're dealing with a vintage airplane. You need to, people need to understand that. You're not going to taxi it over to your FBO and say, I need this oil filter for my Continental engine. There is a network of people that are knowledgeable about these airplanes, and that really gets back to the Type Club, North American Trainer Association. They have a forum board, and people are always asking questions. Hey, I need to get this overhauled. I need to get this done. Does anybody have this inspection cover? And pretty much all of the airplanes have that network of people. Some of them, they're a little more formal, like North American Trainers, T-34 Association, but then others, that there's not that many airplanes. It's just a network of the owners. And, especially on the military side of the airplanes, if they made 10 airplanes, they made spare parts for 20 airplanes. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a tremendous amount of spare parts out there. You can't just necessarily pick up the phone and get them. You have to kind of be, in the loop a little bit. But they're out there, and if a guy has 12 extra generators for his T-28, would he trade one of those generators for a fuel pump? Probably would. So there's a lot of that. And there again, that's getting to know the people, being in the right place, being inside the fence. Those are all important factors.
Yeah, I have heard, and please tell me, correct me if I'm wrong on this, that some of the aircraft, because they were designed to be maintained, designed for heavy use, such as the T6 Texan, the BT-13 Vultee, things like that, are fairly reasonable aircraft to maintain. They're with being accessible, and in other words, yeah, just like any plane, things are going to go, but they're not necessarily going to bury you in maintenance. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, take for example the T-28. You have to think about the purpose of it. That was an advanced trainer to teach, relatively low-time novice guys how to fly the airplane. But also your maintainers that were in the military, those guys went to their 6 months of tech school to be an engine guy or a sheet metal guy or an avionics electrician type guy. And they did that, the rest of their hitch, and they were gone. So there's this constant turnover of the mechanics in the military. So the military manuals are excellent. The wires are all numbered. They make sense. The cannon plugs are numbered. You have the maintenance manuals. All of that makes sense. There's good troubleshooting guides. But for example, the T-28, up in the nose wheel well, there's a little boot up there you take out, and there's actually like a little ladder, and you can take another couple panels out, and you could stand on this ladder with your feet down on the ladder. With your head, you can look towards the front. You can see the back of the engine, the accessories. You turn or look behind you, and you see the back of the instrument panel. So, I mean, it's very, the circuit breaker panel in the T-28 has a couple of Zeus fasteners on it. You open that up, and I think there's 3 big cannon plugs. You can undo those cannon plugs and set the circuit breaker panel on the bench. So, I mean, they're designed to be maintained, flown a lot by novice people and maintained by people with I'm not going to say a low skill level, but a pretty narrow skill level. But, look around at our average mechanics today. I mean, to get your A&P license, you've got to understand engines, you've got to understand electric, you've got to understand hydraulics, all of fabric, all of those things. So our mechanics today are a little more generalist mechanics, and most of them have a lot more experience than the guys in the military did. So
Yeah.
they're relatively easy to take care of.
When I think of the challenges for maintaining an aircraft, usually I end up thinking about it in 2 categories. One of them is access, which you talked about, for example, with being able to just get into everything, because so many regular GA planes, like, oh, so that's what you need to get at? Like, good, as long as you've got 8-foot arms, then you're fine. Like
8-foot arms that are super narrow.
Yes, exactly. But access is always a big problem. And then the other is that there is is everything rebuildable? Can something be disassembled, O-rings replaced, up to, overhauled, in many ways, overhauled in the field? My impression is that a lot of these aircraft check both of those boxes, that access isn't going to be your problem, and even though you may have to do maintenance, most things are meant to be rebuilt. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly the American airplanes, the O-rings that are in the brake master cylinder or in the hydraulic cylinder, are pretty much standard things. There's a few different seals, like some of the flap seals and some of the things in the T6 are a little different. They're not standard O-rings, they're cup seals, but those are available from a number of suppliers. So there's really nothing that's, quote, unobtainium anymore. Mm-hmm. And there again, with the CAD and reverse engineering, and now that the FAA is loosening up some of their approvals on some of these parts, owner-produced parts, and some of these parts that are non-safety critical parts, they're allowing a lot of leeway on the older airplanes, which is good. And that stuff has not proven to have been a safety of flight situation. A lot of those little hydraulic leak here and there, that's more of a nuisance than it is. It's not a safety of flight situation usually.
And there's shops that I've seen you list many times. Covington Overhauled or other, like if you've got something like a Texan or a Vultee, you've got shops that can overhaul those engines fairly easily. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah, there are. Like so many things today, it takes a little longer than it did 5 years ago, but they're out there. I mean, there's quality work being done all the time on the engines and on the accessories. And the heavy-duty structural stuff, ground-up restorations, Oshkosh award-winning type restorations. There's a number of shops that are doing that today. So,
wow. So there's definitely a lot of options available. Now you have in your career, and you can see the smirk on my face, you have had an opportunity to sell to some pretty cool people. Did I understand that if you go see Top Gun Maverick, that Tom Cruise personal P-51 is an airplane you sold?
I cannot confirm or deny that, but I will smile when you mention it.
So that may have passed through your hands for that. Anyone else or any other stories or name drops you want to make?
I mentioned Kermit Weeks earlier, Palm Springs Air Museum, Cavanaugh Flight Museum, the Collins Foundation, Lone Star Flight Museum. As far as some of the big collections of airplanes, I've dealt with pretty much all of those people. I've been lucky enough, if you get a copy of the Forbes 400, there's several of my customers on there who I will not mention, but they are there. I recognize the names. Got to do a few other cool things. One year at Reno in our box, we had the first man and the last man to walk on the moon. That was pretty cool. Get to meet those guys. Was lucky to see the space shuttle launch with John Glenn.
Wow.
I was able to take my father to that. Kurt Brown, who's the Warbird guy, was the commander of that mission. He invited me and a number of the Warbird people down to the Cape to see that launch. That was pretty cool. So I've been on aircraft carrier a couple of times. I'm just, all around, I'm just a very, very lucky individual that picked this little segment of aviation to get involved in, and it's been great for all these years, and it's still great.
Wow. The last thing I want to ask you about is as we march along in the years, it seems that we're starting to get more and more into a category where people are getting their hands on modern jets as being their historic aircraft that are flying. What are your thoughts? What are you seeing in that area? We've seen privately owned Harriers, all sorts of things in there. So what's happening at that, I would think, is the ultimate level of people getting personal ownership of Warbirds?
Well, as manageable as the World War II bombers and trainers and fighters and the post-World War II airplanes, the Sea Furies and the O2s and all that, as manageable as those are for a private individual, the F-14s and Harriers and those types of airplanes, There's a number of A4s out there. Most of those are operating on military contract aggressor things. The logistic support that is required for some of those airplanes is probably very limiting to who's going to want to own those airplanes. Unfortunately, some of that stuff's not even available. But there are some of the MiGs and the Su-27s and those types of airplanes. There are some in civilian hands, F-5s and that kind of stuff. But most of those airplanes, it takes a gigantic dedication as well as, a pretty good checkbook to buy the airplanes, but to maintain those, liquid oxygen systems and, high 3,000-pound hydraulic systems. There's some logistics there, but there again, we're lucky enough that we have owners that are interested in that, have the ability to be able to field those airplanes and take care of them properly. Every year at Oshkosh, we see some pretty cool, really modern kind of airplanes.
Yeah, so it is truly amazing. Well, Mark, I'm looking forward to seeing you in a couple weeks at Oshkosh. Lots of cool stuff. Tell everybody where you're going to be out in the Warbird area.
We will be in the Warbird area, just northwest of the Warbird control tower. We have a motorhome there with a tent in front of it. I will be there all week, and it's actually less than 2 weeks. I think it's 12 days now or 11.
I know. Actually, as I was saying that, I was realizing, oh man, it's time to start packing and flight planning.
It comes quickly, and it ends way too soon some of the time. That is our biggest event every year. It's a great place to show off some of the airplanes we have, inform people of the other airplanes that we have that are not there. But you get to meet the people. People come up and talk to you, and you share information. Years ago, Paul Poberezny says, "We go for the airplanes, but we come back for the people." And I think that's a very, very true statement.
Very, very, very true. And I'm looking forward to seeing you there. And for anyone else who's out there, hopefully we'll bump into you ourselves there at the show. Go over and see Mark at Courtesy. I'll be going over and stopping by as well. And you can learn about all these different things because, again, you could find your way into Warbirds for less than a 182 out there. You can find your way into Warbirds for more than a whole block of houses if you want. So it all depends on where you're looking to be in the spectrum. Well, Mark, thank you so much for taking time to join us here on Social Flight Live, and I really do appreciate it.
Glad to do it.
Excellent. You. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
And to all of you, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join us here on Social Flight Live. We will be back next week on Tuesday, July 18th with Dave Hall, the owner of Moto Art and Plane Tags. They do some really amazing things by taking aircraft that they get out of boneyards and other famous places of retired aircraft and turning them into art for all sorts of places, offices, furniture, or into plane tags that anybody can own. And so very, very cool story of his life in that business that we're going to talk about then. And then, as we talked about, it's AirVenture Week. We'll be posting some things from then, but we won't have a Social Flight Live that week. And then we are back on Tuesday, August 1st with Christine Grinder-Kelly from the United States Air Force. She was the first woman to fly the F-35 Lightning and has a fantastic story, and will put you in the cockpit of that amazing aircraft. Until next time, I'm Jeff Simon for Social Flight. Thank you so much for joining us, and I wish you all blue skies.